It was the winter of 2016 when I stayed at my brother's cabin for the first and only time. I was 33 back then, still working odd warehouse jobs around Manchester. My brother, Greg, had bought the place a couple of years earlier as a getaway from his work and family in Leeds. It was an old, narrow wooden cabin, buried deep in the woods near Cairngorms National Park in Scotland. It sat at the edge of a private plot Greg had gotten cheap through a friend who was selling a string of repossessed properties. I never thought much of the cabin when he first told me about it. He described it as quiet, isolated, a place to write or think. Greg was always someone who needed time alone. But everything changed in December, when he was arrested for assault and burglary after a strange break-in at his neighbor's flat. I knew him well enough to think it wasn't just some drunk mistake. Something had been off about him in the last few months. His wife called me the day after he got arrested. She said the police had taken all his electronics and locked up the house in Leeds. But the cabin, she said, was untouched. She asked if I could head up there and check if he'd left anything strange behind, anything that could explain what was going on. She was worried there were things he'd hidden out there, things the police might not find but could help piece together what he'd been doing. I agreed, more out of obligation than curiosity. I didn't care to dig into his problems, but I knew the cabin wasn't easy to reach. She was hoping I could take a few photos or bring back notebooks, anything that might give them a clue. So I packed a bag, filled up my old Volvo, and drove north. It took nearly 6 hours with the weather turning rough. Roads were slick and winding once I crossed into the Highlands, and by the time I reached the long dirt path leading to the property, it was already dusk. The cabin looked just like I remembered from the one weekend we spent there years before. It had a tin roof patched up with a tarp, dark with siding aged and stripped from wind and rain, and a small wraparound porch mostly covered in snow. Trees loomed thick all around it, tall, narrow pines rising like cold towers. There were no lights, no neighbors for at least a few kilometers. Just silence. You couldn't hear the wind, just the weight of the snow settling on branches. I had a key Greg once gave me. It still worked. Inside, the air was bitter and stale. Everything smelled of old wood, mildew, and something else, like burnt plastic or dried fuel. The first thing I noticed was how cluttered it was. Papers everywhere, notebooks on the ground, drawings on the walls, and there were maps, big ones, pinned and taped across the back wall, all marked with circles, dates, and numbers. None of them made sense. The place had no electricity. Greg had used a portable generator when we were there years before, but I couldn't find it. I lit a lantern I brought with me and set it on the kitchen counter. The faint yellow light made the place feel even smaller. Shadows clung to the corners. I spent the first hour walking through the rooms. There were only 3: the kitchen/living area, a small bedroom, and a narrow storeroom. Nothing looked valuable, just strange. The drawers were stuffed with receipts, some dating back 10 years. There were hunting knives stacked beside old cameras, dozens of them. Most were cheap trail cams, the kind you'd strap to a tree to catch wildlife. There were photographs, too, hundreds of them. Most were landscape shots, snow-covered paths, trees, a shed I didn't recognize. But some of them were of people. I didn't recognize any of the faces. Men, women, even kids, all standing or walking in the woods, some looking straight at the lens, others caught mid-step. The strange part was that almost every one of them was taken from far away, like surveillance, like Greg had been watching them. That's when I started feeling like I shouldn't be there. I stayed the night because I didn't want to drive in the dark, but I didn't sleep. The bed was hard, the cabin freezing. I could hear things outside, twigs snapping, snow sliding off the roof, branches swaying. I told myself it was animals, probably deer. The Highlands are full of them. But the longer I lay there, the more I noticed the sounds weren't random. They came in patterns. One crunch, 2 steps, then silence, then again, closer, like someone walking. At one point, I sat up and looked out the bedroom window. Nothing, just black woods and falling snow. But the feeling stayed in my chest, heavy and crawling. The next day, I took more time going through the cabin. In the storeroom, I found boxes of old equipment. Camcorders, microphones, night vision scopes. All used, all dusty, some broken. There was one metal box that had a combination lock. I didn't try to open it. I left it where it was. But behind a stack of crates, I found something worse. There was a trapdoor under a rug. I hadn't seen it the first night. It was nailed shut with 2 rusted metal bars, and the boards were newer than the rest of the floor, like Greg had recently replaced them. I stared at it for a while, wondering why the hell he'd board up part of the floor. I almost left it alone, but something in me wanted to see what was underneath. Took me an hour to pry it open. When I finally pulled the wood back, I saw a short ladder leading down into a shallow crawl space, maybe 6 feet deep. It wasn't meant to be a basement. It was cold dirt, poorly dug, but someone had added walls, thin plywood boards hammered into the sides like insulation. And there was a light, a single battery-powered bulb hanging from a hook. It was still working. I dropped down and landed in a pool of damp earth. The air smelled like mold and iron. I crouched and moved deeper. At the far end of the crawl space was a small wooden box. Next to it, more photographs, wrapped in twine. Inside the box was a stack of cassette tapes and a black notebook, its cover stained and fraying at the edges. The tapes were labeled with numbers. Just numbers, no names, no titles. I didn't have anything to play them on, but I took them with me. The notebook was full of observations, dates, times, names I didn't recognize. Greg had been writing down movements. Man in gray coat passed trail at 4:37 p.m. Woman with dog seen near creek again. Pages and pages like that. Some names repeated. Some entries had sketches. People's faces drawn with tight pencil strokes, all in profile. I left the crawl space shaking. I didn't know what I was looking at. Surveillance? Paranoia? Was he watching people out there in the woods? Tracking them? I left the cabin late that afternoon and hiked the path behind it, just to see if anything had been left outside. About 400 yards into the forest, I found the shed from the photos. It was barely standing, just 4 walls and a roof rotted at the edges. Inside were folding chairs, more cameras, a space heater, and food wrappers. Someone had been using it recently. Footprints in the snow. Not mine. Fresh ones. I walked back fast, checking over my shoulder the entire time. I locked the cabin door behind me. That night, I heard the footsteps again. They didn't stop. For hours, just pacing back and forth outside. Crunching snow. Moving to the side of the cabin. Then to the back. I turned off my lantern and sat in the dark with my hand on the hunting knife I found in the kitchen. At one point, something knocked twice on the bedroom wall. I froze. Not a twig snapping. Not snow. Knocking. Deliberate. Slow. I waited, barely breathing. No more sounds. Then footsteps moving away. At dawn, I packed everything. I didn't eat. I didn't shower. I didn't even look around. I just took the tapes, the notebook, and the stack of photos and got into my car. There was a truck parked at the start of the dirt road. One I didn't recognize. Old, rusted, mud-caked tires. It was empty. I didn't stop. I drove back to Manchester and never went near the Highlands again. Later that week, I found an old tape deck in my uncle's garage. I played one of the cassettes. It was a recording of breathing. Not talking, not nature, just breathing. Heavy, raspy, like someone had put the recorder in their coat pocket and walked for hours. At the end, there was a sound like metal scraping and then a whisper, too soft to make out. I never played the rest. I gave the tapes and notebook to the police anonymously. I told them it was related to Greg's arrest, that they should look into it. I didn't leave my name. Greg went to prison for the assault. Never said a word about the cabin. His wife divorced him, moved away with the kids. I never asked questions. Never spoke to him again. Sometimes, though, I wonder who was in the woods that night, because I don't think it was Greg, and I don't think it was someone passing by. Whoever knocked, they knew I was there. I'd never really understood why people would want to go out to the middle of nowhere, alone, far from civilization. I'd always been the type who preferred to be close to people, to feel connected to life outside. But when Steve, my old college buddy, invited me to spend a weekend in a cabin he'd rented in a remote forest area, I thought, why not? A weekend of solitude and peace seemed like it would be good for me. I needed to take my mind off things. My job had been overwhelming, and I was still trying to shake off the heaviness of some personal stuff. Plus, Steve insisted that the place was safe and the perfect spot to just get away from everything. The cabin was in northern Michigan, deep in the woods. We had to drive a few hours from the nearest town just to get there. The air smelled fresh, pine trees, damp earth, and something else. Something almost too clean. It was like we were driving into another world, one untouched by human hands. The drive was long, but the scenery was beautiful in its own quiet way, almost serene. It was getting late by the time we pulled up to the cabin. The sky had been clouded over for hours, and now the first few drops of rain started hitting the windshield. I was relieved. I liked the sound of rain. Steve, always the optimist, unloaded his gear from the truck with a grin. "This is going to be great, man. You'll see." He was a big guy, well built from his time in the military, though he'd been out for a while. It was just us this trip, no one else. I wasn't sure why, but something about being so isolated was starting to feel unsettling. Still, I followed him inside. The cabin was rustic, just like you'd expect from something so far out. Wooden beams above, stone fireplace in the corner, large windows that gave you a view of the thick woods beyond. It was cozy, with a slightly musty smell of old wood and dampness. The place was a little run down, but it had charm. A big rug lay on the floor, worn but inviting. A small kitchen, a couple of bedrooms, and a bathroom were all there. But what caught my eye was the large, open space at the back with a set of French doors leading out to a porch. "We've got the whole weekend," Steve said, setting his bag down on the couch. "You good with the place?" "Yeah, it's fine. A little different than I expected, but it'll work." As I looked out the back doors, I realized how truly isolated we were. The nearest neighbor, if there even was one, had to be miles away. The woods stretched on in every direction, dark and thick, with no signs of life other than the wind rustling the trees. It felt like we were the only people on Earth. The rain was picking up now, slanting across the glass in sheets, the sound growing louder, almost deafening. We spent the first few hours settling in, making a fire, and having some beers. Steve was talking about his new job, how he'd been thinking of buying a house. I nodded, trying to relax, but there was something gnawing at me, something about the silence of the place that felt too thick, too heavy. I wasn't sure if it was just my nerves acting up or if it was something more, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. That night, after dinner, we sat out on the porch, listening to the rain and the wind. Steve was in a good mood, but I kept scanning the trees. It was like the woods were closing in around us. My mind started drifting, and I couldn't help but think about the strange things I'd read about places like this. The disappearances, the stories about people vanishing in remote areas. I wasn't scared, not yet, but something wasn't right. We went to bed around midnight. I stayed in the spare room, just across the hallway from Steve's. The sound of the rain against the cabin was soothing at first, but then it became intrusive. The wind howled in gusts, and I could hear branches scraping against the roof. Sleep didn't come easy. Around 2 a.m., I woke up. The wind was still howling, but now I could hear something else. A faint sound in the distance, like a knock or a thud, faint but persistent. It made my heart race. At first, I thought it was just the storm, the trees shifting, the cabin settling, but it was too rhythmic, too consistent. I rolled over in bed, straining to listen. The knock, thud, knock, thud. It was coming from outside. I waited, trying to convince myself that it was nothing. But then I heard it again. It was closer this time, unmistakable. A sharp knock, like someone was hitting the side of the cabin. I froze, my pulse thudding in my ears. I had to check. I grabbed my flashlight and cautiously moved through the hallway, past Steve's room. The door was closed, but I didn't hear anything from inside. I didn't want to wake him yet. The house was dark, save for the flickering light of the fire. I reached the French doors and carefully peeked through the rain-smeared glass. My breath caught. There, in the darkness, was a figure standing at the edge of the porch, just out of the light's reach. The figure was tall and thin, barely visible in the shadows. The sound of the knock stopped, but I could feel the weight of the person's presence. I couldn't see their face, but I knew they were staring at me. I backed away from the door, heart racing, my mind trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. Was it someone who had gotten lost in the storm? Maybe a local who had seen the cabin's lights. But why hadn't they knocked on the front door? Why were they standing in the dark like that? I wasn't sure what to do. I thought about waking Steve, but the last thing I wanted was to freak him out. I waited for what felt like an eternity, staring through the glass. The figure didn't move, didn't even blink. It was like they were waiting for something. Then, without warning, the figure turned and disappeared into the woods. I watched the spot where they'd stood, my breath shallow. They hadn't run, hadn't hurried. They just vanished like they knew exactly where to go. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I tried to shake it off, but the feeling of being watched was still with me. I didn't want to tell Steve about what I'd seen. Not yet. I needed to process it myself. So we went for a hike, just the two of us, through the woods. It was beautiful out, fresh air, the rain having stopped, but something about the woods felt off. I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed, being watched from behind the trees. That evening, things took a turn. We were back at the cabin when we heard the knock again, but this time it was loud, too loud to ignore. My skin crawled. We both turned to the door, but neither of us moved. The knock came again, followed by a scraping sound against the cabin's wood, like something dragging across it. Steve stood up, his face serious now. "Stay here," he said, as if he'd read my mind. He grabbed a hunting knife from his bag, and I watched him walk to the door. Before he could open it, the door was yanked from the outside, slamming against the frame, sending a shock through the whole cabin. Steve flinched, then threw open the door, his knife raised. There was no one there, just the rain, the wind, and the dark. But there, on the ground, was a note. "Leave before it's too late." Steve didn't say anything. He just stared at the note, then at the woods. His grip tightened around the knife. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. The isolated feeling, the sense of being cut off from the world, came crashing down on me. It was real. We were alone out here, but we weren't the only ones in the woods. We decided to pack up, get out of there. The vibe had shifted from unsettling to dangerous. But as we packed, someone was out there watching. I could feel eyes on me, even as I moved inside the cabin. We didn't make it out that night. As we tried to leave, a shadow moved across the porch again. Only this time I knew who it was. The figure emerged from the darkness, their face pale and twisted, wearing a mask that looked like a crude imitation of something human. They didn't speak. They just stood there watching, and I realized with a cold shiver that they had been waiting for us to make a mistake. They had planned for this moment. Steve didn't hesitate. He charged at the figure, knife raised, but it was too late. A scream cut through the air, followed by silence. I was alone. I ran, fast. I didn't care where I was going, just away from that cabin, away from that monster. My heart was pounding, my lungs screaming for air, but I didn't stop. Not until I stumbled out onto the highway, where a passing truck stopped. They found me barely conscious hours later. I never made it back to the cabin. I never went back to those woods. I don't know what happened to Steve. I'm safe now, but I still feel the presence, still hear the knocks in the dead of night. And the message remains clear: leave before it's too late. It's a rainy, miserable night in a small, forgotten part of New England. The wind howls through the trees, sending shivers down my spine as I watch the storm darken the sky. I never expected things to go this way, not in a million years. But somehow here I am, alone, in the middle of nowhere. The cabin is old, weathered, and tucked away in a desolate graveyard, where the only thing that seems to be alive is the wind itself. It's been a long, rough day. My name's Ethan, and I'm 27. I've always enjoyed the peace that nature can offer, but tonight, it feels different. I'd come out here to clear my mind and finish some paperwork I had been putting off for weeks, but that had all changed the moment I took that wrong turn onto the narrow dirt road that led me deeper into the woods. I should have turned back. I should have listened to my gut. Instead, I kept going, and now I'm here, stuck in a decaying cabin with nothing but my thoughts and the sound of the storm for company. I didn't plan to stay here long. My goal was simple: find a place to weather the storm, wait it out, and leave at first light. But I quickly realized I had made a grave mistake. The cabin wasn't like any other I had stayed in before. Its air was thick with a strange, suffocating weight, as though the house itself was holding its breath. The windows were covered in grime, and the only source of light was a small oil lamp I'd found in the corner. The furniture was sparse: an old wooden table, a couple of chairs, and a fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The smell of mold and decay was overpowering. Even the floorboards creaked under my weight, sending unsettling echoes through the empty rooms. I should have left when I had the chance, but something about the place kept me here. Maybe it was the storm outside, or maybe it was the eerie quiet of the graveyard just beyond the cabin. It was unsettling to think about, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something that had nothing to do with the weather. As I sat by the fire, staring into the flickering flames, I began to wonder why this place had been abandoned. I knew there were stories, local legends, rumors whispered in town. They spoke of strange happenings, people going missing, and a long-forgotten tragedy that had unfolded in this very spot. But I dismissed those as nothing more than superstition. There was no real danger here, not anymore, or so I thought. The night dragged on, the wind picking up intensity as it howled around the cabin. The rain hammered against the windows, and I felt the cold creeping into my bones. I tried to focus on the paperwork in front of me, but my mind kept wandering. Every time I looked out the window, I saw shadows moving in the darkness, but I convinced myself it was just the trees swaying in the wind. The graveyard outside seemed to loom closer with every passing minute, like an uninvited guest pressing in on me. At some point, I must have dozed off because when I woke, the room was pitch black. The oil lamp had burned out, leaving me in complete darkness. My heart began to race. I reached for my phone, but of course, there was no signal. I cursed under my breath. I had no choice but to stumble around in the dark, trying to find something, anything that could light the room again. That's when I heard it. A faint sound at first, barely audible over the storm, but it grew louder with every passing second. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, and heavy, as if someone was walking just outside the cabin. My breath caught in my throat. There shouldn't have been anyone out there. The nearest town was miles away, and no one had been on the road when I arrived. I didn't know if I should call out or if I should just stay silent and hope it would go away. The footsteps continued, growing louder, closer. I froze, my mind racing. Who could it be? I knew I wasn't imagining it. The heavy thud of boots on the wet ground was unmistakable. The sound came from the graveyard, and the thought of it made my skin crawl. What would someone be doing out there in the middle of the night? In this storm? I moved quietly, creeping toward the window to peek outside. Through the fogged-up glass, I could barely make out the silhouette of a figure standing among the gravestones. They weren't moving, just standing there in the rain, their face obscured by a hood or a shadow. It was impossible to tell anything about them. The figure stayed still, as if waiting for something or someone. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, the air growing colder with each passing second. I took a step back, but my foot hit a loose floorboard, and the noise was enough to make the figure turn toward the cabin. My heart stopped. For a brief moment, I swear I saw their eyes. They were wide, almost unnaturally so, staring directly into mine through the fogged window. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in short gasps. Panic surged through me. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a rusty iron poker from the fireplace, and held it in front of me like a weapon. I don't know how long I stood there, shaking, staring at the window, but eventually, the figure turned and disappeared into the graveyard. The footsteps faded into the distance, leaving me alone again, though I didn't feel any safer. My heart was still pounding in my chest, and my hands trembled from the shock. I didn't know if I should stay in the cabin or leave and try to find shelter somewhere else. But the thought of walking through the storm, especially through the graveyard, terrified me more than staying in the cabin did. So, I locked the door, bolted the windows, and tried to convince myself it was just some lost traveler, someone who had taken refuge in the graveyard to escape the storm. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. The night dragged on, the storm never letting up. The wind howled, and I could still hear the occasional creak of the floorboards above me, as though the house itself was alive, breathing in the night. I sat by the fire, my eyes darting to every corner of the room, expecting something to move, to shift, but nothing did. I must have dozed off again because when I woke, the first light of morning was creeping through the cracks in the shutters. I was still sitting in the chair by the fire, the poker still clutched in my hand. My body was stiff from the cold, and my mind was racing, replaying the events of the night over and over again. I didn't want to believe what I had seen, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I gathered my things quickly, eager to leave, but when I stepped outside, I was met with an eerie silence. The graveyard was still there, the stones standing tall and unmoving, but there was no sign of the figure from last night. There were no footprints in the mud, no trace of anyone having been out there at all. I don't know what I expected to find, but the emptiness was almost worse than the figure, as if nothing had happened, as if it had all been a figment of my imagination. But deep down, I knew better. I had seen those eyes. They weren't a trick of the light or a dream. They were real. With a deep breath, I turned and walked toward the road. I wasn't sure where I was going, but I knew I needed to get away from this place. I had no intention of ever coming back. As I made my way down the narrow path, I glanced over my shoulder one last time. The cabin stood in the distance, surrounded by the gravestones, but it didn't seem as threatening anymore. Instead, it looked empty, desolate. The rain began to let up as I walked away, and for the first time since arriving, I felt the weight on my shoulders lift. The storm was clearing, and the sun was starting to break through the clouds. It felt like the start of something new, something better. As I reached the end of the road, I looked back one last time. The cabin was still there, sitting in the graveyard, a relic of the past. But the figure from the night before, they were gone. I couldn't explain what had happened, or why I had been so afraid. All I knew was that I wouldn't forget this night, not for as long as I lived. I didn't know if it was my imagination or something more sinister, but I was certain of one thing. That place had a history, and I was lucky to leave it behind. It was early autumn, the kind of crisp air that still carried the faintest warmth of summer but promised the chill of winter soon enough. I was in my mid-30s, recently divorced, and trying to find some peace of mind. Work had been stressful, life had been chaotic, and I figured a weekend away from it all in a cabin might help clear my head. The cabin was located deep in the woods, a couple of hours from the nearest town. It was supposed to be a place to disconnect, something that wasn't too fancy but had the basics. A small kitchen, a wood stove for heat, a few bedrooms, and a cozy living area with a stone fireplace. My friend Mark, who had been to the cabin several times before, recommended it when I told him I was looking for a quiet retreat. The cabin was off the grid, no electricity or internet, just the way I needed it. I drove up on a Friday afternoon. The sun was low in the sky, casting a golden hue over the pine trees as I navigated the winding dirt road. The last few miles were rugged, and the gravel made the tires of my car rumble beneath me. As I turned onto the final stretch of road, the trees opened up to reveal the cabin. It stood alone in a small clearing, its stone chimney puffing a steady trail of smoke into the cool air. The sight of it, simple and secluded, was exactly what I was looking for. The first thing I did was check the inside of the cabin. It was cozy, just as Mark had described, and a sense of calm settled over me. I unpacked quickly, setting up my things in the small bedroom. There were no neighbors, no sounds other than the rustling of the trees and the occasional chirp of a bird. The quiet was almost too much at first, but I welcomed it. The evening passed slowly. I lit the wood stove, threw a log on the fire, and settled into the worn armchair with a book I'd been meaning to read. The soft crackling of the fire was comforting, and after a few hours, I felt myself relaxing. I had a simple dinner of canned soup and some crackers, not caring much about anything too extravagant. This was about solitude, not indulgence. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I decided to go outside for a bit. The air had cooled even further, and the sky above was clear, littered with 1,000 stars. I stood on the porch of the cabin, taking in the stillness. The only sounds were the occasional snap of a twig in the woods and the distant call of an owl. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the cold, fresh air. This place was perfect. That was when I noticed it. From the corner of my eye, I saw a movement in the trees. It was subtle, just a flicker of motion. I didn't think much of it at first, attributing it to the wind or a small animal. But then it happened again, another shift in the shadow of the trees, just beyond the clearing. My heart rate quickened. I told myself it was nothing, that I was just being paranoid. But the movement didn't stop. It was too deliberate to be the wind. I couldn't see what it was, but I had the distinct feeling that something, or someone, was watching me. I stepped back inside, locking the door behind me. The cabin was silent, save for the crackling fire. I spent the next few hours alternating between reading and staring out the window, trying to make sense of the unease that had settled in my chest. I told myself that it was probably a deer or some other animal that had wandered too close. Maybe the shadows of the trees were playing tricks on my eyes. But the feeling didn't go away. It lingered in the back of my mind like a whisper I couldn't ignore. I stayed up late that night, listening to every little noise outside, but nothing else happened. Eventually, fatigue won out, and I fell into a restless sleep. The next morning, I woke up to find the cabin bathed in soft morning light. The cool, crisp air of the night had given way to a warmer, more pleasant day. I went outside to stretch my legs and decided to take a walk through the woods. The landscape was beautiful, the forest alive with the sounds of birds and the rustle of leaves underfoot. As I wandered deeper into the trees, I noticed something strange. There were broken branches, snapped in odd places, as if someone had been walking through the woods with force. The more I walked, the more I saw signs of disturbance. Tracks in the mud, bent shrubs, and footprints that didn't quite look like they belonged to any animal I knew. They were too wide, too heavy, as if something larger had been moving through the forest. A chill ran down my spine. I hadn't seen anyone since I arrived. I was supposed to be alone here. I hadn't heard anyone else's vehicle. No signs of life beyond my own. Yet, the longer I stayed out there, the more certain I became that something or someone had been in the woods recently. I didn't want to overthink it. I turned back toward the cabin, walking faster now. As I neared the clearing, I saw something that stopped me dead in my tracks. A set of fresh footprints, large and heavy, leading right up to the cabin. My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't noticed them when I'd left. They weren't there when I first came outside, and they certainly hadn't been there before I'd gone for my walk. The tracks were deep in the soft earth, too large to be human, and they circled the cabin in a pattern that made no sense. They led from the woods around the cabin and then back into the trees. My thoughts raced. I knew there were no neighbors nearby. Mark had told me that the cabin was completely isolated. But now, with these strange tracks, my mind was filling with possibilities. Someone had been here. Someone had been watching me, and they were still nearby. I went back inside, locked the door again, and grabbed my phone. Even though I knew there would be no signal out here, I tried calling Mark just to hear a familiar voice, but of course, the call didn't go through. I sent him a quick message, telling him about the footprints and the strange feeling I had, hoping he might reassure me. But there was no reply. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I tried to keep myself busy, chopping some wood for the fire and fixing a simple meal, but my mind kept returning to the tracks outside. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every time I glanced out the window, I half expected to see someone standing at the edge of the trees, just watching. As night fell, I couldn't ignore the feeling any longer. I had to leave. I wasn't staying another night in this place with whatever was lurking around. I packed up my things in a rush, not caring if I forgot something important. I just wanted to get out of there. The drive back down the dirt road felt longer than it should have, the trees closing in around me as if they were trying to trap me. When I finally reached the main road and the safety of civilization, I breathed a sigh of relief. I was shaken, my nerves on edge. I didn't know who or what had been out there, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going back to that cabin. Not ever. Weeks passed before I heard anything else. Mark texted me a couple of days later, asking how the trip went. I didn't mention the footprints or the feeling of being watched. Instead, I told him it was a peaceful, relaxing time, just as I'd originally planned. Then, about a month later, I received a strange message from a local ranger. He asked if I had stayed in the cabin recently and if I'd noticed anything unusual. Apparently, a couple of hikers had gone missing near the area, and they had found tracks that matched the ones I had seen around the cabin. The ranger said they were still investigating but advised that I stay away from the woods for a while. I never went back to that cabin. It was for the best. I didn't need any more answers. What happened out there stayed with me, and I learned to trust my instincts that day. Some things are better left unexplored. I was never one for the typical idea of a vacation. The crowds, the noise, the fast pace. It wasn't for me. So when I decided to take some time off work, I opted for something different. A solo trip to a cabin in the woods. It wasn't far from where I lived in central Maine, just a few hours drive up through the winding, narrow roads. I wanted a place where I could clear my mind, get away from everything. A cabin, hidden deep in the woods, tucked away in a valley, seemed like the perfect spot. The year was 2023, and I was 31 years old. At that age, life feels like it's moving too quickly, always going from one thing to the next without ever really pausing to take a breath. I worked long hours as an IT consultant, and the constant stream of emails and meetings wore me down. I needed to disconnect, be somewhere far away, quiet enough to think but not lonely enough to feel abandoned. The cabin was small but cozy, just the way I liked it. When I first pulled up, I almost didn't believe it was real. The trees surrounded it like a wall, the kind that felt comforting and suffocating at the same time. A single gravel driveway led to the small wooden building, which had a porch that creaked with every movement of the wind. It was picturesque in its own rugged way. I had rented it for 3 days, a short getaway, but with no real plans in mind. I didn't intend to hike, fish, or explore the woods like others might. I just wanted some peace and quiet to read, write, or maybe stare out the window at the trees and mountains in the distance. It was an unseasonably warm fall day when I arrived, the sun hanging low and golden in the sky, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The air smelled of pine and earth, mixed with the faintest trace of wet leaves. I unloaded my car, grabbing a duffel bag of clothes, a cooler filled with snacks and drinks, and my backpack with a few books and a journal I hadn't written in for years. Inside the cabin, the wood was dark and polished, the walls adorned with rustic touches like antler chandeliers and old, framed pictures of hunting trips. It felt both homey and a bit too much like a tourist trap. Everything was a little too perfect. The smell of wood and old leather was heavy in the air, the kind of smell that clung to everything, even when you tried to escape it. I explored the cabin, getting comfortable in my surroundings. A small kitchen, an open living room with a stone fireplace, and a loft upstairs where the bed was. It was simple but perfect for a weekend alone. I decided to settle in, cooking a simple dinner for myself, nothing fancy, just grilled chicken and some rice. As night began to fall, I lit the fireplace and settled in on the couch. The warmth of the flames crackling in the hearth was soothing, and for a while, I thought everything was exactly as it should be. That was until the sounds outside the cabin started to change. It wasn't anything major at first, just the usual rustle of the wind in the trees, the occasional snap of a twig. But then there was something more, a heavy thud. It sounded distant, but close enough to make me pause. I sat up, my eyes narrowing as I listened, trying to determine the source. Maybe a deer, I thought, or a bear. It wasn't unusual to hear wildlife, especially in the deep woods. But the thud came again, louder this time, as if something was walking just outside the cabin. I stood up, walking cautiously to the window, and pulled back the thick curtains. The porch was dark, shadows stretching in strange shapes under the faint moonlight. I couldn't see anything, no sign of life. I told myself it was just an animal, probably just the wind or a branch falling. But something didn't feel right. My instincts, the kind you can't really explain, told me I wasn't alone. I pushed the thought aside, dismissing it as paranoia. It was just the isolation playing tricks on me. The night carried on without much incident after that. I went to bed, and for a while I slept soundly. The sound of the wind outside, the crackling of the fire dying out in the hearth, made for a calming lullaby. But then I woke up, suddenly and without warning. The moon was higher in the sky now, casting cold light through the window. My heart raced as I heard it. Footsteps, soft but deliberate, the sound of something or someone walking on the gravel path outside the cabin, moving slowly and with purpose. My first thought was that it was another hiker, maybe someone who had gotten lost or was looking for a place to rest. But the more I listened, the more certain I became that this wasn't the case. These footsteps weren't accidental. They were controlled. Whoever or whatever was out there knew exactly where they were going. I lay still in bed, not moving, not breathing too heavily. My mind raced through all the possibilities. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and I hadn't passed anyone on the road when I arrived. There was no one else around for miles. The footsteps stopped right outside the window, just a few feet from where I lay in the loft. I could almost feel the presence on the other side of the thin wall, just a few inches away. My breath caught in my throat. Should I check? Should I hide? My mind was a jumble of frantic thoughts, but my body didn't want to move. Fear gripped me, paralyzing me in place. The moment stretched on, and the footsteps never resumed. The night was silent again, eerily so. I must have fallen back to sleep at some point, though I don't remember when. The next morning, I woke up with a headache, as if I hadn't slept at all. The sun was up, and the world outside seemed peaceful once more. But I knew better. Something was wrong. I spent the rest of the day trying to brush off the events of the previous night. Maybe I'd imagined it all. The isolation was messing with my head, I told myself. But that nagging feeling, the one that told me I wasn't alone, never quite went away. Later that afternoon, I decided to go for a walk, to clear my head. The weather was nice, sunny, with a slight breeze rustling through the trees. The forest was beautiful, the autumn colors starting to turn the leaves bright shades of red, orange, and yellow. But as I walked deeper into the woods, something felt off. Every snap of a twig underfoot made me jump. Every rustle in the trees made me spin around, heart pounding. I walked for about an hour before I came across a small clearing. It was quiet here, too quiet. The air felt still, thick with an unnatural silence. I noticed something strange on the ground. A pair of boots, well worn but not old. They were placed carefully, side by side, just at the edge of the clearing. Whoever had left them behind was close, but they weren't around now. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt an undeniable urge to turn back, to go straight to the cabin and lock the door. I didn't run, but I didn't walk calmly either. I hurried back toward the cabin, trying to push the fear down. As I neared the clearing's edge, I saw something else in the distance: movement. A figure, tall and thin, standing just behind a tree, watching me. I froze. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, too still, too quiet. My heart thudded in my chest as I realized the truth. Whoever had been out there the night before had been watching me, and now they were watching me again. I didn't hesitate any longer. I turned and sprinted back to the cabin, my legs burning as I ran up the gravel path. I slammed the door behind me, locking it with trembling hands. The rest of the evening was a blur of fear. I stayed inside, keeping the curtains drawn, the lights off. Every noise outside sent me into a panic. Every rustling in the trees seemed like footsteps. Every snap of a twig like someone approaching the door. I didn't sleep that night, not a wink. Every few minutes I would check the windows, check the door. I told myself I was being paranoid, but the feeling never left me. It wasn't until the early hours of the morning, when the first light of dawn started to creep through the trees, that I finally allowed myself to relax. The figure in the woods was gone, and the footsteps had stopped. But as I made my way out the next morning, the boots were still there in the clearing. And this time there was something else. An object, half buried in the dirt, a small leather pouch. I didn't touch it. I didn't need to. I packed up and left early that day. I didn't look back. As I drove down the winding road, the sun fully up now and the woods behind me fading into the distance, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. Whatever had happened, it was over, or so I thought. It was one of those trips where I should have turned back the moment I had the thought. But at the time, it felt like nothing would go wrong. Just a weekend getaway, a break from the constant grind. The air had a crisp bite to it as I drove down the dusty, narrow road. The car's headlights bounced off the uneven surface, lighting up patches of rough gravel and the dense woods that surrounded me. I was in the middle of nowhere, about 2 hours north of Glenford, in the quiet part of Vermont. A cabin I had rented for a few nights was supposed to be the perfect escape. No distractions, no work, just some time to relax. I didn't expect the place to be quite so isolated. The map had shown me a stretch of road that seemed to lead straight into the woods. No real landmarks or signs, just trees and more trees. The cabin itself sat at the end of a long dirt path, tucked away like it had been forgotten. The closer I got, the heavier the air seemed to feel, as though the place itself was holding its breath. I shrugged it off, chalking it up to the eerie silence of the woods. When I pulled up to the cabin, the first thing I noticed was the absolute lack of any other structures nearby. The house sat alone on a small plot of land, its peeling wood siding weathered by years of neglect. A few steps led up to the front porch, but it looked abandoned in a way that made my stomach churn just slightly. The windows were dark, and the place had a distinct feeling of being left in a hurry, almost as though it had been vacated in the middle of something. But there was no for sale sign or any indication that this was anything but a forgotten rental. I grabbed my bag from the trunk and made my way to the door, fidgeting with the key the rental agency had sent me. It was old, and the keyhole felt like it belonged to a different era. When the door creaked open, I stepped inside, and the smell of dust and stale would hit me immediately. The interior was just as outdated as the exterior. Antique furniture covered in dust, cracked floorboards, and a fireplace that hadn't been used in years. But there was something strangely comforting about it. The old, worn furniture, the dim lighting. It felt like the kind of place I could unwind, despite its age. I set down my bags in the living room and walked around, surveying the cabin. It had a tiny kitchen, a narrow hallway leading to 2 bedrooms, and a bathroom with a tub that looked like it hadn't seen a scrub in decades. I wasn't expecting luxury, but I had to admit it was more rustic than I anticipated. Still, I figured I'd make the best of it. The first night, everything was fine. The silence was comforting, though it grew heavy as the hours passed. I spent the evening reading a book by the fireplace, a flickering flame dancing in the hearth. It wasn't until the wind picked up that I started to feel the unease that I hadn't been able to shake off. The wind howled through the trees outside, and every now and then I'd hear a strange noise, like something scraping against the walls. But it wasn't the kind of thing you could put your finger on, just the wind, I thought, or an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer scratching at the cabin. I wasn't all that familiar with the woods, but I'd heard stories, and I knew the sounds could play tricks on you. That night, as I lay in bed, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I told myself it was nothing, a trick of the mind, a little too much silence, but the feeling wouldn't go away. The creaky floorboards, the scratching sound at the window, they all mixed together to create an unsettling soundtrack for the night. I pulled the covers over my head and tried to sleep, but sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, I made coffee and spent some time outside, walking around the cabin. It was peaceful, despite the odd feeling still lingering in my chest. As I wandered into the woods behind the cabin, I noticed the ground around the trees was damp, and there was a faint trail leading deeper into the forest. Something about the path felt intentional, like someone or something had deliberately walked that way. But I didn't follow it. Instead, I returned to the cabin, deciding it was better to just relax and stay close to my temporary home. As the day wore on, I started to notice strange things, little details that seemed out of place. A chair in the corner of the living room had been moved, the kind of thing that could have been done by accident, but it unnerved me all the same. I checked the doors, the windows, everything was locked, as it should have been. I told myself that I was just being paranoid. That evening, after dinner, I decided to take a quick walk into the woods. The air had started to cool down, and the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon. I didn't venture too far, just a few yards beyond the cabin, but as I turned to head back, I caught sight of something out of the corner of my eye, a figure moving through the trees. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but then I saw it again, clearer this time. Person standing still, half hidden by the trees. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to do. The figure was too far away to make out any details, but I could feel the weight of their presence. I turned and hurried back to the cabin, my pulse racing. I locked the door behind me and pulled the curtains shut, though it did little to ease my growing anxiety. The night dragged on. The wind howled, the trees creaked, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The air felt heavier now, and I was sure someone or something was watching me. But there was nothing I could see, no footprints in the dirt outside, no signs of anyone else. It was as though the figure had vanished into thin air. The next morning, I packed my things, ready to leave. I wasn't scared, not exactly, but there was an undeniable sense of wrongness about the place that I couldn't ignore. As I loaded my car, I glanced back at the cabin one last time. The windows seemed darker now, almost like they were hiding something, and the air felt colder than it had the day before. I turned the key in the ignition and drove off, leaving the cabin behind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it had followed me. The road back was long and winding, the trees closing in around me as I drove, but I didn't care. The further I got, the more I felt a sense of relief. The cabin was behind me, and whatever had been there would stay there, locked away in the woods. When I finally reached the nearest town, I stopped at a small diner for some coffee. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with a kind face, glanced up at me as I entered. "You been out there?" she asked, gesturing vaguely toward the woods. I nodded, not sure how to respond. "Well, you're lucky you made it out," she said with a grim smile. "Not many who go out there come back. That cabin's been abandoned for years. People say it's cursed or that it holds memories from a long time ago. But who knows? Some things are better left alone." I didn't ask her to explain. It wasn't necessary. I had already figured that much out. As I sipped my coffee, looking out at the rain starting to fall, I realized something. The unease I'd felt back there, the feeling of being watched, it wasn't just a trick of the mind. There was something off about that place, something that couldn't be explained away by the usual explanations. But the important thing was I had left, and I had no intention of ever going back. It was a cold, overcast morning in early November when I arrived at the cabin. The trees were a dull mix of browns and grays, their once vibrant leaves having long since fallen to the forest floor. I'd been assigned to this mission out of nowhere, no explanation, just orders. Special forces aren't about questions. They're about actions. That's why I was here, alone, at this rundown cabin in the middle of nowhere. The place was isolated, far from any town, and hidden deep in the woods. The roads were narrow and barely navigable, and I had driven for hours just to find the cabin. I didn't even know exactly why I was here, just that something had gone terribly wrong, and I needed to fix it. I stepped out of the vehicle, the chill of the air biting through my jacket. The door to the cabin creaked as I pushed it open. The smell of mildew and stale wood filled my nose. The inside was dim, the only light coming from the few gaps in the weathered wooden walls. My boots echoed on the cracked wooden floor as I entered. It was empty completely. There were signs that people had lived here, but it had been a while. Dust covered every surface. Furniture was overturned, and broken glass littered the floor like a trail of breadcrumbs leading to nowhere. I surveyed the room carefully, instinctively checking every corner. My training told me to be cautious, to never let my guard down. Something was off. I could feel it, a low hum of tension in the air, like the calm before a storm. And that's when I saw it. On the far wall, there was a bloodstain, a large one. It had dried and darkened over time, but the shape of it was unmistakable. It had spread across the floor, as if someone had dragged their body, or perhaps been dragged themselves. The faint outlines of boot prints were visible in the blood. I crouched down, examining the marks closely. They were fresh enough to be recent, but old enough to be fading. I reached for my radio but hesitated. I wasn't supposed to make contact unless absolutely necessary. Whatever had happened here was something I needed to figure out on my own. There was a sense of dread hanging in the air, a feeling I couldn't quite shake. I moved deeper into the cabin, carefully stepping around the debris. As I reached the back door, I heard a noise, a soft creak. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, listening intently. Nothing. But then it came again. The faintest sound of something moving, slowly, deliberately. Someone or something was here with me. I pushed the door open, the rusted hinges groaning under the pressure. The cold wind whipped through the doorway, carrying with it the scent of pine and something else. Something metallic. The backyard was a mess, overgrown with weeds and littered with what appeared to be broken equipment. A few yards away, I saw a wooden shed that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. I could hear it now, the sound of footsteps, soft and purposeful. Whoever or whatever it was, they were moving cautiously, as if they knew I was here. My grip tightened on my rifle as I made my way toward the shed. I didn't know what I was expecting, but I wasn't going to be caught off guard. The footsteps stopped as I neared the shed, and I could feel my breath becoming shallow. My pulse quickened, but I steadied myself, taking slow, deliberate steps. I rounded the corner of the shed and found a man. He was crouched down, his back to me, wearing tactical gear. His posture was stiff, his head down. But there was something wrong, something off. I reached for my radio again, but then I saw it, the blood. It was everywhere, spattered across the ground, smeared across his gear. I couldn't see his face, but the amount of blood made it clear that something violent had taken place. I took another step closer, and that's when he turned. His face was covered in blood, his eyes wide and wild. He stared at me, his mouth agape, his lips trembling. He was trying to say something, but no words came out. His hand was gripping a knife, no, not just any knife. It was a combat knife, the kind used by special forces. And then it hit me. I knew this man. His name was Alex. He was part of the team I'd trained with for years. But there was something deeply wrong with him now. He looked like a shell of the person I remembered. His skin pale, his eyes hollow, like he wasn't entirely there. Before I could react, he lunged at me. My training kicked in immediately. I sidestepped, raising my rifle and knocking him to the ground. The knife scraped across the dirt, coming to rest a few feet away. I stood over him, my breath heavy in my chest, my finger hovering over the trigger. But I hesitated. I couldn't bring myself to kill him. Not like this. "Alex," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "What the hell happened to you?" His eyes met mine, wide and full of terror, but there was no recognition there. It was as if he didn't even know me anymore. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Instead, a guttural, animalistic growl slipped from his throat. And then, before I could react, he made another attempt to grab the knife. I didn't give him the chance. I knocked the knife from his hand and pinned him to the ground, my knee pressing into his chest. The struggle lasted only a few seconds before he stopped moving. His body went limp, and his eyes glazed over. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I didn't know what had happened to him, what had turned him into this monster. But I knew one thing: he wasn't the only one. I searched the shed quickly. The walls were covered in bloodstains, and there were more signs of a violent struggle. Broken equipment, destroyed furniture, and a few odd objects I couldn't make sense of. But what really caught my attention was a file. It was lying on the ground, half hidden behind a pile of crates. I opened it quickly, scanning through the papers inside. It was a Special Forces operation report, a covert mission. Alex had been a part of it, along with several others. They had been tasked with extracting a high-value target from a remote location. But the mission had gone wrong. It had gone terribly wrong. I didn't need to read further to understand the implications. This was a mission gone south, and whatever had happened here, whatever had turned Alex into this thing, it was bigger than I had anticipated. It was worse than I could have imagined. I grabbed the report and ran back to the cabin, my mind racing. I couldn't trust anyone. I didn't know who was behind this or what their endgame was, but I couldn't let it end here. I had to make it out. I had to survive. I returned to the cabin, trying to piece together what I had learned. The wind howled outside, and the forest seemed alive with danger. Every noise, every rustle of the leaves felt like a threat, but I couldn't afford to be afraid. I had to focus. I heard the sound of footsteps again, but this time I wasn't alone. Another figure stepped out of the shadows. A woman. She was wearing military gear, her face covered by a mask. Her eyes were cold, calculating, and she held a gun in her hands. She wasn't here to help. She was here to finish what Alex had started. She raised her weapon, aiming directly at me. But I didn't freeze. I didn't hesitate. I dove to the side, rolling into cover. I had only one chance, and I wasn't going to let it slip away. The cabin was small, and there was nowhere to run, but I knew this area better than she did. I knew the layout, the weak points. She was good, but I was trained to survive. The next few minutes were a blur of gunfire and adrenaline. The woman was fast, but I was faster. I had the upper hand, but she wasn't giving up easily. She moved like a shadow, darting from one corner to the next, never staying in one place for long. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I found my opening. I fired, hitting her in the chest. She collapsed to the floor, her gun slipping from her hand. I walked over to her, breathing hard, and checked for a pulse. She was gone. I stood there for a moment, taking in the silence. The storm had passed, and the forest was eerily still. The tension that had hung in the air was gone. It was over, for now. I didn't know who had sent her, or what had really happened on that mission. But I knew I had to get out of there, and I had to do it fast. I grabbed the report and the radio, making sure I left no trace behind. As I left the cabin, the weight of the situation finally sank in. I didn't have answers, but I had survived, and that was enough, for now. The rain had started before I even got to the cabin. It wasn't the heavy, furious kind of rain that you see in movies, but the steady kind that soaks into your bones over time. I pulled up to the ranger station at Pine Ridge National Park, a small, isolated stretch of land about a 3-hour drive from the nearest town. Most people never made it this far out into the woods, and I could see why. It wasn't the kind of place that drew tourists for scenic views or perfect trails. It was rugged, untamed, and the weather could turn on you in an instant. The cabin was small, built with dark timber, and it sat just off the main park road, tucked into a small clearing surrounded by towering pines. The kind of place you'd expect a ranger to live, if that ranger had a penchant for solitude and didn't mind being completely cut off from civilization for days at a time. I had been assigned this shift for the next week. Usually, the cabin was only occupied by a single ranger during the off-season, when fewer visitors came through. It wasn't a popular job, and I had accepted it hoping for some peace and quiet. The last few months had been stressful, and a remote location sounded perfect. Little did I know how quickly things could go wrong when you're alone in the woods. As I unloaded my gear from the truck, the wind picked up, rustling the trees and sending a chill through my jacket. I hurried inside, eager to get settled and out of the elements. The cabin smelled like wood and pine, with a faint trace of something musky I couldn't quite place. It wasn't unpleasant, just unfamiliar. The inside was simple but functional. A wood stove sat in the corner, ready to keep the place warm, while the small kitchen had everything I would need to survive on my own for a while. Basic supplies, a few cans of food, and a half-empty bottle of whiskey left behind by the previous ranger. The bunk in the back was the only bed, and the thin, faded curtains barely blocked out the darkening sky. I set to work unpacking and organizing, but there was something odd about the place that I couldn't shake. It was quiet, too quiet. Normally, the woods had their sounds, birds, the rustle of leaves, distant animal calls. But here, it felt like the forest was holding its breath. I didn't think much of it, chalking it up to the bad weather and my nerves. I figured I'd get used to the isolation soon enough. By nightfall, the rain hadn't stopped, and the wind was howling. The storm was picking up intensity, and I was starting to wonder how much longer I'd be able to stay inside without feeling like I was losing my mind. That's when I heard it. A knock. It was faint at first, but distinct enough to break the silence of the cabin. 3 sharp raps, almost like someone was trying to get my attention. I froze, my heart thumping in my chest. It didn't make sense. There was no road that passed by the cabin, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. Who could it be? I slowly approached the door, peering through the small window next to it, but saw nothing but the rain-soaked dark of the woods. I opened the door cautiously, scanning the area. Nothing. No car tracks in the mud. No signs of anyone nearby. Just trees and rain. I stepped back inside, my pulse racing. Probably just my imagination, I muttered to myself, locking the door. But then the knock came again. 3 raps, followed by silence. This time, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the flashlight I'd left on the counter and stepped outside, shining the beam across the clearing. The rain was coming down harder now, turning the ground into a thick, wet mess. The flashlight swept across the darkened forest, illuminating the wet trunks of trees and a few scattered rocks, but nothing else. I didn't know what I was expecting to find. A stranded hiker? A ranger from another station? But there was no one. The storm had picked up, and the darkness felt oppressive. My breath came in short bursts, my heart still pounding in my chest. I stood there for a moment, just listening. The wind whipped through the trees, but that was it. No footsteps. No rustling in the brush. No signs of life at all. After a few minutes, I shut the door behind me and locked it again, my hands shaking a little more than I'd like to admit. The knock was nothing more than some weird coincidence. I told myself, a branch tapping the door or maybe an animal outside. The night dragged on. I tried to focus on the fire in the stove, the flickering light casting long shadows across the room. But that's when I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of a knock. 3 knocks once more. This time, my instinct wasn't to check the door. I could feel it in my gut. Something wasn't right. I grabbed my rifle, which I'd kept in the corner, and checked the window. The rain was coming down so heavily now, it was hard to see anything past the immediate edge of the cabin. But I could have sworn I saw a shadow moving in the distance. It was quick, like something or someone was passing by. I waited, rifle in hand, watching the dark forest. Minutes passed. Nothing. It wasn't until I turned my gaze back to the cabin door that I saw the mud. Fresh prints just outside the threshold. They weren't there before. I knew that for sure. But now, there they were, 3 distinct footprints in the wet ground, leading away from the cabin and into the woods. I stood frozen, unsure of what to do. Who would be out here in the middle of this storm without any kind of equipment or proper gear? And why would they knock only to leave without a word? I considered calling for help. The nearest ranger station was hours away, and I knew cell service wouldn't work out here. I could have tried to drive to the nearest town, but the road was washed out in parts, and driving in the storm was risky. Instead, I decided to wait for the storm to pass, wait for daylight. The hours dragged on, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke to the sound of another knock. This time, it was closer, right at the door. I didn't hesitate. My hand was already on the rifle, my pulse racing as I slowly crept to the door. I could feel the heat of the stove behind me, the only warmth in this cold, desolate place. I pressed my ear against the door, listening. Nothing. The knock came again, harder this time. But when I opened the door, there was no one. Just the rain beating down on the wooden steps. I couldn't take it anymore. I knew I had to leave. I couldn't stay here alone another night, trapped in this isolated place with whoever or whatever was out there. I grabbed my gear, packed it quickly, and opened the door to the storm. I had no idea where I was going, but anywhere felt better than staying in that cabin, listening to the knocks. As I stepped into the rain-soaked forest, I felt the weight of the isolation pressing down on me. I moved quickly, the rifle slung across my back, trying to push the fear out of my mind. The storm was deafening, the wind pushing against me as I stumbled through the wet undergrowth. That's when I saw it. A figure, standing just ahead of me, barely visible in the downpour. A man, wearing a hooded jacket, his face obscured by the shadow. I froze. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there, watching me. For a long moment, I thought about running, but I didn't know where to go. There was nowhere to hide. And then, as suddenly as he had appeared, the man turned and disappeared into the trees, vanishing into the storm. I didn't wait around to see if he would come back. I ran. I ran faster than I ever had before, not stopping until I reached the nearest road, far from the cabin, far from the woods. I didn't look back. The following morning, I reported the incident to the authorities. They found the cabin abandoned, no signs of forced entry or a struggle, and the footprints were gone. Whoever had been knocking was never found. The strange part? No one had heard of anyone living out there for years. The cabin had been scheduled for demolition long before I ever arrived. Some things I guess you just can't explain. It was late autumn when I decided to return to my grandmother's cabin. The leaves had just started to turn amber and gold, carpeting the woods with their vibrant hues. I hadn't been there in years, and something about the place kept pulling me back, even though I hadn't visited since I was a teenager. The memories were still sharp, of the long, quiet days spent exploring the surrounding forest, of evenings spent by the fire with my grandma telling stories, and of those rare moments of calm and peace that seemed to envelop everything when you were miles away from civilization. This time, though, I was alone. My grandma had passed a few years ago, and the cabin was left to me. No one else seemed to care much about it. My cousins weren't interested in the place. They preferred the city, but I'd always felt connected to that cabin in the woods, even more so after her death. The drive there took a few hours. The road was narrow and winding, and the last few miles were filled with thick trees and the occasional rustle of animals in the underbrush. It had rained earlier, and the damp smell of wet earth lingered in the air, mixing with the scent of pine. As I turned onto the dirt road that led to the cabin, My tires kicked up small clumps of mud. The cabin wasn't much. A small, one-story building with a rusted metal roof, surrounded by dense trees. My grandma had always kept it simple, but there was a warmth to it that made it feel like home. I parked my car outside the cabin and stepped out, feeling the chill in the air. The wind had picked up, making the branches of the trees sway. For a moment, it felt like time had stopped, like I had stepped into a different world, one where nothing had changed since I last visited. I took a deep breath, the cool air filling my lungs, and headed to the front door. The wooden steps creaked under my weight, and I had to remind myself to be careful. The cabin hadn't been maintained for a while. When I pushed the door open, the familiar scent of old wood and dust hit me. The interior hadn't changed much either. The same worn-out furniture sat in the same spots, and the fireplace still had the same soot-stained stones. The first few hours passed quietly as I unpacked and started a fire. The crackling of the wood and the warmth from the flames gave me a sense of comfort, but there was also an unsettling feeling that lingered. Maybe it was the isolation. Maybe it was the fact that I hadn't been here in so long. But something about the place felt off. As night fell, the silence deepened. There were no sounds of cars passing by, no streetlights flickering, just the wind and the occasional animal noise in the distance. I made a simple dinner and sat at the table, eating slowly, trying to get used to the stillness. After a while, I decided to go outside. I figured a walk in the cool air would help clear my mind. The sky was clear, and the stars sparkled above me. I wandered down the old path my grandma used to take, the one that led to a small creek at the edge of the forest. The trees were so thick in some areas that it felt like walking through a tunnel of leaves and branches. I hadn't gone far when I noticed something strange. There was a faint sound in the distance, almost like a whisper, but I couldn't quite place it. It was soft, like wind moving through the trees, but it seemed different. I stopped for a moment, listening carefully. The sound stopped, and then, in the quiet, I heard something else. A faint crack, like a twig snapping underfoot. I wasn't alone. I froze, my heart beginning to race. I glanced around, but all I could see was the darkness of the woods surrounding me. The air felt thicker now, heavier, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I turned back toward the cabin, telling myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or something else that was making its way through the underbrush. But as I walked quickly back toward the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every few steps, I'd hear another soft snap of twigs or rustling in the bushes. But whenever I turned around, there was nothing there. The sound was always just out of sight, just out of reach. I reached the cabin's front door and quickly stepped inside, locking it behind me. My hands were trembling, and I took a few deep breaths to steady myself. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination, or perhaps a coyote or raccoon wandering too close. The isolation was getting to me. I sat down by the fire and tried to relax. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. There was a heaviness in the air, an unease that gnawed at me. The shadows in the cabin seemed to stretch longer than they should, and the flickering of the fire only seemed to make them dance in strange patterns. Then I heard it again, a soft knock, at the back door this time. I stood frozen, staring at the doorway. My heart thudded in my chest. Who could it be? No one lived for miles around. Couldn't be anyone I knew. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by a scraping sound. It sounded like someone was dragging something heavy across the porch. I didn't know what to do. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. I wasn't sure if I should check, or if I should just stay inside and pretend I hadn't heard anything. My gut told me to stay hidden, but curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and cautiously moved toward the back door. The wind had picked up again, howling through the trees, but the noise from the back of the house was still there, a slow, deliberate scraping. I opened the door just a crack, the beam of the flashlight cutting through the dark, revealing the back porch. There was nothing there. The light illuminated the empty space, casting long shadows across the wooden planks. I stepped outside, the cold air hitting me immediately. My heart raced, and I looked around nervously, scanning the surrounding woods. There was no sign of movement, nothing but the wind and the rustling of the leaves. Just as I was about to turn back inside, I heard the sound again, but this time it was different. It wasn't coming from the back porch. It was coming from the trees. Something was out there. I stood still for a moment, my body tense. There was no sign of anything, no movement, no sounds, just the dark and the quiet. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something, a figure standing still in the shadows, just beyond the tree line. It was hard to make out at first, but as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw it more clearly. A man, tall, wearing a dark coat, standing perfectly still. His face was hidden in the shadow of the trees, and he didn't move, didn't blink. I could feel my breath catching in my throat. My mind raced. Who was he? What was he doing out here? I had to make a decision: go inside and lock the door, or approach him and find out what he wanted. Before I could make up my mind, the man took a step forward, his footfall loud in the quiet of the night. It was a slow, deliberate step, as if he was aware I was watching him. I stepped back, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't know what this man wanted, but the danger in the air was undeniable. I didn't wait. I slammed the door shut, locked it quickly, and stood with my back against the door, listening. The sound of footsteps stopped. For the next few hours, I didn't move. I didn't hear anything else, but the silence felt oppressive, as though something was just beyond the walls, watching, waiting. In the morning, when the sun rose and the forest was bathed in golden light, I opened the door cautiously, but there was no sign of the man. No footprints, no evidence of anyone having been there. It was as if the night had erased everything. I didn't feel safe anymore. The quiet, peaceful cabin that once held so many memories now felt like a place of danger, of unease. I spent the next few days there, constantly on edge, looking over my shoulder, but nothing ever happened again. The man never returned, and so I left. I didn't go back. The cabin remained in the woods, its shadows growing longer with each passing year. Sometimes, when I drive by, I catch a glimpse of it through the trees, and I can't shake the feeling that something still watches from within. But that's just how it is with places like that. They hold memories, both good and bad, and sometimes they hold secrets too dark to ever be revealed. It was late October 2014 when I took time off work to finally build the small cabin I'd been planning for almost a year. I was 34 then, single, no kids, no obligations, just tired of city life in Leeds. The land I'd bought sat about 40 miles outside of Inverness in the Scottish Highlands. Wooded, cold, remote. Not a complete wilderness, but the sort of place where you could shout and no one would hear you, and where cell service came and went like a breeze. I'd scouted the area in summer and marked out a clear space on a shallow slope beside a line of trees. It wasn't deep forest, just a tight ring of pine and birch trees lining one side of the clearing. The other side sloped down toward a thin brook. It was a beautiful piece of land when the sun was out, the sort of place you imagined yourself retiring to with a dog and some peace. I didn't go up there expecting trouble. I didn't go up there for some retreat from a dark past. I went to build a small cabin, a single-room place with thick insulation, a simple wood stove, and enough space to be comfortable in for a few days at a time. The plan was to work on it through fall and be mostly done before the first hard freeze. That first week was uneventful. Cold at night, yes, and the ground was already hard from the changing season. But I had my tools, my blueprints, and enough food in the van to last 2 weeks. I parked the van just off the dirt road, 100 feet or so from the site. I brought a heavy-duty tent and had it pitched just inside the tree line. I'd sleep in the tent and keep my gear in the van. It wasn't until the 6th night that it rained. And it rained hard. Scottish rain isn't always a gentle patter. It's a constant, cold, slashing thing that blows sideways with the wind. The wind that night didn't howl. It groaned through the pines and rattled the tarp I'd stretched over some lumber. I remember lying in my sleeping bag, fully clothed, listening to the trees shifting above me, each creak sounding too close, too heavy. I didn't sleep well. By morning, everything was wet. The ground was slushy with water that had nowhere to go. My boots were soaked from the few seconds it took to step outside. I made some tea on a small gas stove and checked the lumber. The tarp had mostly held, but the edges had soaked up plenty of moisture. I brushed off what I could and worked through the day anyway. I got the lower wall frames up and started placing the floor joists. I wore gloves, but they were useless after an hour. Everything was slick, muddy, and cold. I should have taken a break that night, but I told myself that I'd get more done if I just worked through a few hours after dark. I had a headlamp and a portable lantern, the battery-powered kind that burns a dull yellow glow. Not perfect, but good enough. The rain had lightened to a drizzle, and I didn't want to lose a whole day to weather. I kept hammering late into the evening. I was crouched near the base of the frame, trying to get a stubborn joist aligned, when I heard something behind me, twigs snapping. It wasn't unusual to hear noises in the woods. There were foxes, deer, maybe the odd pine marten or badger. But this wasn't a small animal sound. It was heavy and slow. 2 steps, a pause, another 2. I stood up straight and shut off the lantern. Just for a moment, I clicked off my headlamp too and stood in the pitch black, listening. The forest was dead quiet. Just the drizzle and a soft wind. I waited, maybe 2 minutes. I told myself it was probably nothing. I switched the lights back on and walked toward the tent. I zipped myself in, kept the lantern on, and read until I was too tired to keep my eyes open. I told myself again that it was nothing, probably an animal, maybe even a branch falling. But the next day I noticed something. Footprints. Not mine. Mine had a distinct tread, heavy work boots. These were thinner, longer, shallower. They looked almost like trainers. Not fresh, but not completely washed away either. They curved behind the frame I was building, off toward the trees. I walked out about 20 feet, and then they disappeared into the mess of wet leaves and undergrowth. It gave me a chill. Not fear exactly, not yet, but unease. I stood there, squinting at the ground for a while, then just went back to work. What else was I supposed to do? The day passed slow. I got the floorboards mostly down and started setting the short wall in place. Felt good to get into a rhythm, to sweat again. The ache in my legs and back helped push out that strange feeling. I didn't stop until just before sundown. That night it poured again. A harder rain than before, with low thunder in the distance. I stayed in the tent. I didn't feel like working in the dark anymore. I played a few songs on my phone, ate some canned stew, and dozed off around 10. Sometime later, must have been after midnight, I woke up. It was a sound that did it. Something sharp, distinct. Not wind, not rain. A click, like metal. I sat up slowly, my sleeping bag still zipped. I stayed still, listening. There it was again. Click, the van. It was coming from the van. I unzipped the bag and grabbed the headlamp. I didn't switch it on yet. My boots were at the foot of the bag, and I slid them on, still inside the tent. The rain was heavy again, hitting the canvas like small stones. I unzipped the flap just a crack and looked out. Nothing, just black trees and rain. I stepped out quietly. The The ground sucked at my boots. I walked low, keeping the headlamp off, my hand hovering near the small camp axe I kept clipped to the frame of the tent. I got halfway to the van when I saw it. A figure, standing near the front bumper, not moving. I dropped to one knee in the wet grass. My heart thudded in my throat. The shape was tall, maybe my height, but thinner. Couldn't make out clothes or features in the dark. Just the shape of a person in the rain. Then it turned. Not a full turn, just a shift. It must have heard me. I didn't breathe. It stood still again for maybe a minute. Then it walked. Not toward me. Around the van. Slowly. It disappeared behind the far side. I stayed frozen. Nothing moved for another 2 minutes. Then 5. I counted in my head. After 10, I moved back to the tent. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I stayed in my sleeping bag with the axe beside me, listening. The rain never let up. By morning, the ground was soaked through. The van was undisturbed. Doors closed. No signs of anything. I checked the area. No fresh prints. The ground was too churned up with mud and water to show much anyway. But I know what I saw. I made tea and didn't eat. My appetite was gone. I told myself maybe it was a hiker, a hunter, maybe someone else camping out. But no one parks out here. You need to know the old road even exists. Still, I stayed. That part's hard to explain. Maybe it was pride. Maybe I didn't want to seem like someone who scares easy. I just wanted to finish the cabin. So I worked all day. I worked through the chill in my chest and the sore ache in my stomach. I worked until sundown. I didn't hear anything that night. I kept a small hatchet in the sleeping bag with me. I put my boots on and slept like that. Ready, just in case. The next day, I found something that made me stop working entirely. It was near the back of the clearing, where the trees start to thicken. I only saw it because I went to relieve myself farther from the site. A pile of stones, deliberate, stacked. Flat rocks about a foot wide each, maybe 8 stones arranged into a little pyramid. That didn't sit right with me. That wasn't natural. Animals don't do that. Rain doesn't do that. Wind doesn't do that. People do. It was old. Moss along the sides, but recently disturbed. The moss wasn't even wet anymore. Something had shifted it. I didn't touch it. I walked back to the tent, packed my gear, and got in the van. I left the cabin half finished. I didn't go back for a month. Even then, I only returned in the daylight with a friend, just to collect the tools I'd left behind and pack the rest of the lumber into the trailer. That winter, I tried to sell the land. Couldn't. The buyer backed out after visiting the site. Didn't say why. I ended up holding on to it until 2018, when I sold it for half what I paid. I never did finish the cabin, and I never camped alone again after that. But I remember every second of those nights. The rain, the weight of the silence, the shape by the van, and that pile of stones, standing quiet in the trees like it had always been there. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted, but I never went back to find out, and I never will. The rain came down in sheets, relentless, pounding the roof of the cabin with a kind of fury that made the walls groan. The glass cabin was a strange thing, a modern structure made entirely of clear walls and ceilings that blended the outside world with the warmth of the interior. Some would say it was beautiful, but I always felt like it was a bit too exposed, a bit too fragile against the wilderness surrounding it. I was alone for the weekend. My friends had backed out at the last minute, so I ended up taking the trip alone, despite the warnings of a storm that had been tracking its way up the coast. But I needed to clear my head, to get away from the noise of the city and the weight of the life I was building, or rather, the life I was supposed to be building. I hadn't had time to think in months, and even if the storm was fierce, I was looking forward to the solitude. I liked the idea of being enclosed in this glass box, isolated from everything but the wild rain and the constant hum of the forest outside. I pulled my jacket tighter as the wind howled, rattling the edges of the glass panels. It wasn't the cold that bothered me. It was the feeling of being watched. The cabin was located deep in the woods, far from any main road, where the nearest neighbor was miles away. I liked the isolation, but sometimes, as night fell and the rain grew heavier, I couldn't shake the thought that something was out there, lurking in the dark. I spent the first couple of hours unpacking, getting settled, and taking in the surroundings. The place had everything: a fireplace, a large bed with thick blankets, a small kitchen with all the modern amenities. But it was the glass walls that caught my attention the most. The design of the cabin made it feel like you were living in a fishbowl, with no real barrier between you and the outside world. The rain made the glass fog up, distorting the view, but I could still see shapes moving through the mist, trees swaying, shadows crossing the yard. I hadn't planned to do much that night, so I lit the fireplace, grabbed a book, and settled into the corner chair with a glass of whiskey. The fire crackled, and the storm raged on. Time passed slowly in the cabin. I didn't mind. It was peaceful, almost meditative. As the evening wore on, though, I began to hear strange noises. At first, I thought it was the storm, the wind bending the trees, the rain hitting the roof. But then there were sounds I couldn't explain. A faint tapping, almost like a distant knock on the glass. I stood and peered out, but there was nothing, just the dark, wet forest stretching into the distance. Maybe it was a bird, or the wind blowing branches against the glass. But the noise continued, irregular, as if something, or someone, was trying to get my attention. I laughed it off, chalking it up to my own nerves. Still, I couldn't stop checking the windows, peering out into the rain, hoping to spot something that would explain the sound. But nothing. The shadows remained just that, shadows. It wasn't until the power flickered out that I felt a real sense of unease. The lights dimmed, then went completely black. I fumbled around for my flashlight, cursing under my breath. The fire still burned, though casting a warm, flickering glow against the glass. I switched on the flashlight and scanned the room. Nothing had changed, but that feeling of being watched intensified. My skin prickled, my heart rate quickened. I stepped outside to check the power lines, but the wind was too strong, and the rain came down so hard that I couldn't make out much beyond a few feet. I called the power company, but the storm was widespread, and they weren't able to send anyone out immediately. I was stuck, alone in the dark with no one around for miles. Back inside, I secured the doors and windows, trying to ignore the pounding in my chest. But the noises continued, the tapping now louder, more insistent. I walked around the cabin, shining the flashlight through the glass walls, trying to see where it was coming from. The shadows outside moved with the wind, but nothing was there. I settled into the couch, trying to calm myself, but sleep didn't come easy. The storm continued its fury against the cabin, but it wasn't the storm that kept me awake. It was the feeling that someone else was here with me, watching from the trees. I heard it again, louder this time, a definite sound, a knock on the glass. I froze, my heart pounding in my throat. I stood up and moved closer to the wall, peering out. There, on the other side of the glass, was a figure, a man. He was standing just beyond the edge of the porch, his face barely visible, obscured by the rain. He didn't move, just stood there, staring at me. Couldn't breathe. For a long moment, I just stood there, frozen in place, not sure whether to call out or run. My mind raced through 1,000 scenarios. A prank? A hunter who'd lost his way? But there was no reason for anyone to be out here, especially in this storm. It made no sense. Yet the figure remained unmoving, as if he had been there for ages. I backed away slowly from the window, my flashlight shaking in my hand. My mind screamed at me to lock the doors, to grab the rifle I kept in the closet, but my legs wouldn't move. The man was still there, standing motionless, watching. Then, as if he heard my thoughts, he turned and started walking away, disappearing into the forest, melting into the mist like a shadow. I didn't know whether to feel relieved or terrified. Something wasn't right about it. There was no reason for someone to be out there, especially in the middle of the storm. The rest of the night passed in uneasy silence. I kept the lights off, the flashlight on standby, and the rifle within reach. Every time the wind howled or a branch cracked, I tensed, my eyes darting to the glass walls, expecting to see that figure again. But nothing. The storm eventually subsided, and the rain slowed to a drizzle, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world of soggy trees and mist. I ventured outside, my boots sinking into the mud as I walked toward the edge of the forest. There was no sign of the man, no tracks, no clues that anyone had been out there at all. I stayed for the rest of the weekend, though I was never truly comfortable. The unease never left me. I couldn't explain what had happened, and as I drove away from the cabin on Sunday afternoon, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone watching from the tree line. I never went back. I sold the cabin a few months later, not because I was scared, but because something about that place had changed me. The feeling of isolation, of being exposed, had stayed with me, and I knew that no matter how beautiful or modern it was, there would always be something unsettling about a glass cabin in the middle of nowhere. I left the woods behind, but a part of me will always wonder if I was truly alone that night, or if someone was out there, just waiting. It was January 2004 when I left my job in Leeds and decided to take some time away from people. I was 32, recently divorced, and worn down from years of working long shifts in construction and dealing with things I had no energy left to fight anymore. I needed air, not just fresh air, but space around me. Somewhere quiet where I didn't have to see or hear anyone. That's when I remembered my uncle's farm cabin in the Scottish Highlands. The cabin was on a patch of land he inherited from a friend who passed away in the late 80s. It was about a 40-minute drive from the nearest small town, a place called Kinlochnagan. No one used the cabin in years. My uncle said he hadn't been there since 1997. It had no running water, no central heating, and no phone line, but I figured that was part of the appeal. I wanted off the grid. I left in the second week of January. The drive was long and slow. Once I passed Inverness, the roads narrowed, turned slick with ice in the corners. By the time I reached the old gravel path that led to the cabin, the sun was setting. There was a rusted gate with one hinge half hanging off, which I pushed open by hand. I had to leave my car about half a mile down because the track was too snowed over. I carried my gear the rest of the way, mostly tins of food, water, a camping stove, sleeping bag, axe, and a few tools. The cabin was smaller than I remembered from the pictures. It was a single room with a little wood stove in one corner, a sagging cot in another, and a few shelves nailed into the wall. The roof was tin, the logs were gray with age, and the door groaned on its hinges when I opened it. The place smelled of old wood, ash, and rodent droppings, but it was dry and the walls kept the wind out. That first night was calm. I lit a fire, cooked some beans, and listened to the wind slide across the hills. No phone, no emails, no one asking where I was or when I'd be back. Felt like stepping out of the world. I spent the next few days fixing things up. I patched a hole in the roof with a tarp, cleaned out mouse nests from the corners, and chopped some of the rotted firewood stacked outside. Every day was gray and freezing, and every night dropped to well below zero. I had to keep the fire going all night or my hands would go numb by morning. I settled into a routine. Wake up, make tea, walk around the property, write in my notebook, chop wood, sleep. It was on the 5th day that I noticed the tracks. I was walking the southern edge of the land, where the treeline thickened and rose into a steep hill. Snow had fallen that morning, fresh and powdery, and when I passed near a cluster of bare trees, I saw boot prints. Not mine. They were older, maybe from the night before, but they led across the snow and disappeared into the woods. I followed them a bit, thinking maybe a hunter had passed through, though I hadn't seen any signs of people since I arrived. But after 20 yards, the prints stopped. Just stopped. No turnaround, no animal tracks, no slide marks. It was like the person vanished mid-step. I told myself it was nothing. Snow can play tricks like that, especially when it drifts or melts in patches. Still, I felt unsettled that night. I kept the axe beside my sleeping bag and didn't fall asleep until the fire died down around 3 in the morning. The next few days, things got weirder. First, it was the birds. I noticed they'd gone silent. Even in winter, you hear birds, crows, robins, something, but I hadn't heard any for 2 days. Then there were the marks on the door. 3 long scratches, like someone had taken a metal rake to the wood. They were fresh, splinters still clinging to the grooves, and I knew they hadn't been there before. I checked around the cabin for signs of animals. Nothing. No droppings, no fur, no paw prints. Just cold snow and that wind that never stopped. One night, I heard footsteps on the porch. It was around midnight. The fire was low, and I was still awake, sitting up in my sleeping bag with the lantern burning low. The sound was slow and heavy. One step, another, then silence. I waited, holding my breath, straining to hear over the wind. I heard it again, wood creaking under weight. I grabbed the axe and waited near the door, but nothing happened. No knock, no sound after that. I opened the door after 15 minutes and stepped out into the cold. No one was there. I checked around the cabin, shining my torch into the trees. No prints this time. The snow looked untouched, smooth and cold, but I knew what I heard. I started sleeping during the day and staying up through the night. Couldn't relax. I would hear strange sounds out in the woods, branches snapping, something moving fast just beyond the treeline. I tried to chalk it up to animals, maybe deer or a fox, but it didn't feel like that. It felt like something was watching me. One morning, I found a dead hare nailed to the back of the cabin. It was fresh, blood still dripping. The nails were thick and rusty, driven straight through its paws and head. It wasn't a predator. It was a message. I took it down, buried it far out past the treeline, and burned the gloves I'd used. After that, I started making plans to leave. I told myself I'd stay until Sunday and then head out. But 2 nights before that, the worst thing happened. I woke up to the sound of something scraping the window. It was slow, metal on glass. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't move. The window was small, near the stove, covered by an old curtain I'd hung up with nails. The scraping stopped. Then came a knock, one single knock, on the wall beside the window. I waited 5 minutes before moving. I crept across the room and peeked out the curtain. There was a man standing just beyond the window. He was tall, wearing a dark coat, and his face was hidden by the angle and the shadows. He wasn't moving. He was just standing there, facing the cabin. I stepped back slowly, picked up the axe. I didn't have a phone, no way to call anyone. I locked the door and sat in the corner with the axe, waiting for the sun. When light came, he was gone. I walked out and looked for prints. There were none. I left that afternoon, packed everything in 15 minutes, barely stopped to put out the fire. I had to drag my gear through the snow again to reach the car. The whole time I felt like something was behind me, just beyond the trees. I didn't stop to look. I drove for hours without stopping, Didn't even eat until I reached a small petrol station back near Inverness. I called my uncle from a payphone and told him I'd left early. I didn't say why. He didn't ask. 2 months later, I got a letter from him. He'd gone up to the cabin to check things out. He found the door open, the inside trashed. Someone had torn the mattress to shreds, thrown ashes everywhere. He also found something hanging from the ceiling, a bag made of rabbit skin, tied with twine. Inside were bones and bits of fur. No one in town knew anything. Police said it was probably kids. I never went back. I live in Cornwall now. Quiet place, close to the coast. I still like silence, but not the kind I heard up there. That cabin taught me that sometimes silence isn't peaceful. Sometimes it means something's watching, waiting. I kept the axe. It's in my shed, rusted now, but I haven't thrown it out. Every so often I still dream of that knock on the wall. Just one. Clean. Heavy. That cabin was real. What happened there was real. I can't explain it, but I know I wasn't alone. I don't think I ever was. It was in late October 2018 when I took some time off from work to get away from everything. I was 33 then, living in Derby, working in insurance, and completely burned out. I'd gone through a rough breakup earlier that summer, and my apartment had started to feel like a cage. I needed quiet. I needed space. I needed to be nowhere, away from screens, phones, emails, just air and silence. That's how I ended up booking a remote cabin near Kielder Forest, up in Northumberland, not far from the border with Scotland. It wasn't a place I'd been before, but I found it on a listing website, tucked away deep in the woods and run by a quiet older man who lived miles down the road. The cabin had no Wi-Fi, no television, and barely any signal. That was part of the appeal. I'd brought a few books, some food, warm clothes, and thought I'd just spend a week cooking, reading, and walking the forest trails. When I got there, the drive in itself was a bit of a journey. The last 10 miles were single-track lanes, winding through tall trees that had gone orange and brown with autumn. By the time I reached the cabin, it was already getting dim. The sun had dropped behind the hills, and everything had that cold, damp smell: wood, earth, and moss. The cabin was better than I expected. It was small, made of old timber, and had a wood stove in the corner. There was a little kitchen area, a table, a bed tucked into the back wall, and a decent bathroom with running water. The electricity was solar-powered, and there were backup gas lanterns hanging on the wall just in case. I liked it instantly, felt solid. No frills, but no fake charm either. Just quiet and stillness. I unpacked, cooked some pasta, and sat at the table eating while the wind picked up outside. The windows were old, double-paned but foggy from years of condensation. You could hear the trees creaking and rustling. By the time I climbed into bed, it was fully dark, and I hadn't seen a single other soul since leaving the Maine road hours earlier. I slept surprisingly well. The first few days passed quietly. I stuck to the same routine, made breakfast, walked a few hours through the forest trails, returned, read, made dinner, and went to bed early. I only saw one other person the entire time, a man on a quad bike who passed me on the trail around mid-morning on the second day. He nodded as he went past and didn't say a word. That suited me fine, but things started to feel off around the fourth day. It started with small things. Nothing dramatic, just a sense that something was different. I was walking the same trail I'd used before, a loop that passed an old stone wall and curved down into a small dip near a stream. That morning it was misty, not heavy fog, but just enough to make the trees look a bit further away than they were. The air was damp, still. I remember stopping near that stone wall and feeling, very suddenly, like someone was watching me. I hadn't heard anything, but I turned and looked back along the path I'd just walked. No one was there. I stood still for a moment, listening. It was completely quiet.
No Birdson.
No wind. Just the kind of stillness that makes your skin prickle. I didn't see anything, so I kept walking. But I kept checking behind me every minute or so, even though I felt silly doing it. That night, back at the cabin, I locked the door. I hadn't been locking it before. I didn't see the point being so far out, but that evening it just felt right to. I also pulled the curtain across the back window, which I usually left open to see the stars. I didn't read much that night. I just felt unsettled. The next morning, I woke up to find something strange. There were marks in the dirt outside the front door. Not footprints exactly, not deep enough for that, but it looked like something or someone had walked around in front of the cabin during the night. The ground was soft from rain the day before, and the faint outlines of something had disturbed the surface. It looked like narrow heel marks, light but deliberate. I crouched down and stared at them for a while. Could have been an animal, I told myself. A deer maybe, or just the wind knocking something loose. But the pattern was odd. They formed a half circle in front of the door, like someone had stood there, just facing it. I let it go, told myself it was nothing. I didn't want to ruin the trip by letting my mind wander. But things kept getting stranger. That afternoon, while I was out on another walk, different trail this time, one that went uphill toward a ridge, I caught movement in the trees to my right. It was fast, just a flicker, maybe 100 feet off the trail. I froze and stared into the woods. I couldn't make out anything at first, just leaves, trunks, and that shifting, dappled light. But then I saw her, a woman. She was standing behind a tree, just far enough back that I could only see her partially. Long, dark coat, pale face, and something about her posture was wrong. Stiff, like she wasn't hiding but wasn't trying to be seen either. Just standing there, still as stone. I stared, didn't move. She didn't either. I must have stood there for 30 seconds, heart hammering, not knowing what to do. Then I blinked, and she was gone. I don't mean she disappeared. I mean when I blinked, the space behind the tree was empty. I didn't hear her walk away. No sound at all. I walked back to the cabin. I didn't run, but I walked fast. Every few steps I checked behind me. The forest felt different now. Less like a place and more like a container. Like I wasn't alone inside it anymore. When I got back, I checked the door. Still locked. Nothing moved inside. But I shut all the curtains and kept the stove going, just to feel some sense of control. I didn't sleep that night. I lay there with the covers pulled tight, listening. Sometime around 2 in the morning, I heard something outside. Not footsteps, something brushing against the wall of the cabin. A slow dragging sound, like someone running their fingers across the wood. It moved from one side of the cabin to the other, then stopped. Then it happened again. From the back wall this time, dragging, then silence. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Eventually, it stopped. When the sun finally came up, I got up and looked around. I didn't go outside straight away. I looked through the windows, checking each angle. Nothing. But when I finally stepped out and walked around to the back wall, I found something that stopped me cold. There were scratches. Not deep ones, not like claw marks or anything dramatic, but light, horizontal scratches just below the window, like someone had scraped the wall with a stick or fingernails. They were fresh, bits of wood still curled at the edge. That was when I seriously considered leaving, packing up, calling the owner, and just driving back to Derby. But something stopped me. Pride maybe, or just plain stubbornness. I didn't want to admit I was scared. I told myself I'd stay one more night, just one. That afternoon, I didn't go walking. I stayed inside, made tea, read, and kept checking the windows. Every few hours, I circled the cabin, looking for signs. There was nothing, until the sun went down. I was sitting at the table with a lantern burning when I heard something outside again. Not dragging this time. Tap. Just one. On the back wall. Then another. 2 taps. Like knuckles on wood. I stood up, slowly, not breathing. Then came 3 more taps. I walked over to the back window, moved the curtain an inch, and looked out. She was standing there, clear as day. A woman in her 50s maybe. Long dark coat, gray-streaked hair, thin face, pale skin. Her eyes were locked on the window. Her face was completely blank.
No anger. No smile.
Just stillness. She didn't move, didn't blink. I stepped back, heart hammering. After a minute, I looked again. She was gone. I ran to the front door, locked it, bolted it, shoved the chair in front of it. Then I checked every curtain, every window, every lock. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat on the bed with a flashlight, waiting. No more taps came. The next morning, I stepped outside just after dawn. There were footprints this time, clear ones. They came from the tree line, circled the cabin, and stopped right at the back wall. I followed them with my eyes. They led away again, back into the forest. That was it. I was done. I packed everything in 20 minutes, shoved it all in the boot of my car, and drove. Didn't look back. Didn't even leave a note. I called the cabin owner from the nearest petrol station with signal. Told him I had an emergency and had to leave early. I didn't say anything about the woman. He didn't ask. I drove straight home. 6 hours. Got back after dark. For days after, I kept checking my windows. Kept expecting to see her face again. But I never did. I tried to forget about it. Told myself it was just someone passing through. Some recluse from the woods. Maybe she didn't mean harm. Maybe she was confused. Lost. Maybe I just caught her at the wrong time. But there was one thing I never told anyone. A week after I got back, I got a letter.
No stamp.
Just folded, hand-delivered, stuck through my door. No writing on the outside. Inside was one thing. A photo, black and white, grainy, of me, standing at the back window of the cabin, looking out. And just behind the glass, behind my reflection in the photo, you could see her. That same woman, standing just behind me, face pale, eyes locked on mine. That was the last time I ever went into the woods alone. It was October of 2014 when I decided to take a solo trip up into the woods near Flathead National Forest, Montana. I had just turned 38, and things had gotten messy at home. I'd gone through a divorce the year before. My dad had died in February, and I was barely sleeping. I needed to get away from everything, just for a bit. I wanted somewhere quiet with no cell reception, where I could think or at least forget about everything for a few days. My cousin Clay had an old hunting cabin he said I could use. It was way off the grid, about a 3-hour drive from Kalispell and then another hour or so down some narrow dirt trail that cut through a mess of thick woods. Clay said he hadn't used it in years, but that it was still standing, had a wood stove, and a spring out back. He told me it'd be perfect if I wanted peace and quiet. That's all I was after. The cabin sat on a patch of land surrounded by pine trees and steep hills. You couldn't see it from the road, and the nearest neighbor was maybe 10 or 12 miles away. I drove out there on a Thursday morning, reached the trail by noon, and it took me another hour to carefully crawl my truck down the rutted dirt path. The trees on both sides leaned over like they were trying to shut the whole place in. When I finally got to the clearing, the cabin was smaller than I expected. It was one room with a low roof and a lean-to shed off the back. It was rough, but it'd do. I parked the truck, stretched my legs, and walked around the place. There were some old tools under the shed, rusted saws, an axe with a warped handle, a busted lantern. The door was swollen and stuck, so I had to give it a shoulder to get inside. It smelled like mice and old wood, but I was used to that. I'd spent plenty of time in cabins growing up. There was a cot in the corner, a small table by the front window, and a pile of wood stacked next to the stove. I'd brought plenty of food, a solar lantern, and a small cooler. No electricity, obviously, but I didn't care. I liked that about the place. No buzzing lights or buzzing phones, just silence. That first day, I unpacked, gathered some more firewood, and walked a little ways up the ridge behind the cabin. The forest felt different than I remembered as a kid. Denser, still, like it was holding its breath. I figured it was just because I hadn't been in the woods in years. But even the wind seemed quieter, just little gusts that barely moved the treetops. I made a small fire that night and sat outside until it got cold. The sky was dark and clear, no moon yet, just stars stretching out in every direction. The only sound was the occasional creak of the trees. It was exactly what I thought I needed. That night I slept light, not because of fear or anything, but because my back was still getting used to the cot. I heard a few noises, branches snapping, something walking in the brush. But that's normal out there. You hear animals moving all the time. I drifted in and out, listened to the wind rattling the window shutters, and eventually fell asleep for real around 3 in the morning. The next day was colder, the kind of cold that sticks in the air and doesn't leave. I walked down past the spring and followed a game trail for a while, but I kept getting the feeling that I was being watched. I know how that sounds. I've been hunting since I was a teenager, and I've tracked plenty of deer and elk. I know what it feels like when something's looking at you, but there was no sound, not even a twig snapping, just that feeling. I didn't see anything, so I headed back and tried to shake it off. I chopped some wood, heated up chili for dinner, and tried reading an old paperback I brought, but I couldn't concentrate. The wind had picked up, and the trees were moving in a strange way, not swaying with the wind, more like trembling, like they were shaking off something they didn't want. That night, I heard footsteps. It was just after midnight. I hadn't been able to sleep and was sitting up in the cot listening to the fire crackle. Then I heard it, just a few steps, slow and careful, like someone trying not to be noticed. I froze and held my breath. The sound came again, a few feet closer. Definitely not an animal. The steps were deliberate, spaced like a person's. I killed the lantern and sat in the dark. My eyes adjusted, and I looked toward the window. Nothing, just black shapes. I waited, holding still, barely breathing. The footsteps circled around the cabin and stopped near the back. Then silence. I didn't move until sunrise. When it got light, I stepped outside and walked around the cabin. There were footprints in the dirt behind the shed. Bare feet, long, narrow, toes spread wide, too big to be human, too long. They weren't fresh, like someone had just been standing there. They were deep and spread out like whatever made them had been crouched low. Watching, I told myself it was a bear or maybe a cougar, something that stepped weird. But I knew better. I've tracked both. This wasn't that. The prints were wrong. The shape was wrong. And bears don't walk around cabins like that at night, not in silence. They crash through things. They grunt. They leave claw marks. I should have packed up and left right then. But I didn't. I was stubborn. I told myself it was nothing. I was just rattled. It had been a rough year, and maybe I wasn't thinking straight. I cleaned up, chopped more wood, and tried not to look at the prints again. That night, I didn't sleep. Something came back. I heard it after midnight again, moving through the trees. Slow at first, then faster. It circled the cabin, moving between the trees and then stopping. Every now and then it let out a sound I can't really describe, like a person trying to sound like an animal. A dry, hoarse croak, followed by silence. It made the hair on my arms stand up. At one point, it scraped its fingers or claws or whatever it had along the side of the cabin, just enough to let me know it was there. I held my rifle tight, sat in the dark, and didn't move. I never saw it, but I could feel it out there, waiting. When morning came, I found more tracks. Not just one set this time. Two, both barefoot. One smaller than the other. Both sets circled the cabin, then disappeared into the woods. That day, I stayed close. I didn't hike. I didn't chop wood. I sat inside and watched the tree line. I didn't eat much, just a granola bar and some water. I didn't want to use the stove or draw attention. I kept waiting for them to come back, and I knew they would. By the time night came, I was jumpy. I locked the door, shoved the cot and the table against it, loaded the rifle, and sat with my back to the wall. They came again, just after midnight, but this time they didn't circle. They stood just beyond the trees, just out of sight, making that same broken sound. One of them moved closer. I heard the dry leaves crunch under its feet. Then I saw the shadow outside the window, tall, lean, shoulders hunched forward like it didn't know how to stand upright. Then, for a split second, it passed by the window. That was the first time I saw it clearly. It wasn't human. It had the shape of one, but the limbs were too long, the joints bent the wrong way, and its head was too low, like it didn't belong where it was, like it had been put together wrong. It moved in sudden, jerky bursts, not like an animal, but like someone imitating movement without understanding how it worked. I didn't sleep. I sat there, rifle in hand, heart pounding, waiting for them to try the door. But they didn't. They just moved around, circled, and made those awful, choking sounds. Sometimes I'd hear them whisper, not words, just sounds, like they were trying to learn language, mocking it. They left just before dawn. That was the last straw. When the sun came up, I packed everything in under 5 minutes. I threw it in the truck, didn't care about folding or cleaning, didn't even check to see if I left anything. I started the engine and backed out of that clearing so fast I nearly clipped a tree. I didn't stop for anything, not even when I hit the road. I drove straight to Kalispell and didn't slow down until I was surrounded by pavement and gas stations and people. I didn't tell anyone the full story, not even Clay. I just said the cabin gave me the creeps and I cut the trip short. I left out the part about the footprints, the shadows, the noise, the thing I saw through the window, the things. I never went back to the cabin. A year later, Clay told me it burned down in a lightning storm. No one was hurt. No one was there. He asked if I wanted to help rebuild it. I told him no. Whatever I saw out there, whatever followed me those nights, it wasn't a person. And it wasn't an animal. It was something else. Something that knew how to walk like us, how to move like us, but wasn't us. It stayed in those woods. It didn't follow me back. But sometimes when I go camping, when I'm far from town in the dark, staring into the trees, I swear I can feel it watching. I don't stay in cabins anymore. I sleep in my truck, doors locked, rifle close, and I never stay more than one night in the same place. Because I know what's out there now, and I know it watches, and waits, and it doesn't forget.